Thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay, this is working. It's the first time I've tried this, so we'll see it. Anyway, this is Lunar Module 2, the way it looks today. And I'll be talking about that. I'm going to start with a little bit of history of the space program, why we needed a lunar module, why it took this shape, and why we took the directions that we did to get to the moon. So I'll go ahead and start the first one here. Okay. Some of you were alive back then, probably most of you weren't, but the space race really got started October 4th, 1957, when what was then the USSR launched Sputnik. And it went into orbit, and it really surprised the heck out of all the Westerners. Anyway, we didn't know they were that far along. But the big concern was, if they can launch a 184-pound satellite that goes beeping every 90 minutes over the U.S., what could they do with a nuclear weapon or something? So there was a lot of high drama and stuff all during this time. The Russians had a big leap in front of us with not only that, but then with manned missions. On April 12th, 1961, a cosmonaut named Yuri Gagarin was the first human to go into orbit, made one orbit and came down and landed. We followed that with a 15-minute suborbital flight that Alan Shepard, one of the Mercury 7 astronauts, flew on a Mercury Redstone, landed 302 miles downrange, but it didn't go into orbit. And so that's all the space experience we really had, besides sending up a few chimpanzees and other monkeys and animals. So we didn't really have a whole lot to go on. And then just 3 weeks later, after Alan Shepard's flight, President Kennedy shocks everybody with this speech here. So I have just a little snippet of it.
The goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
So, I mentioned we had very little experience, 15 minutes of spaceflight for the United States, and now President Kennedy says, let's go to the moon. Well, we didn't even know what we didn't know. So it was I've talked to a few engineers who were listening on their car radios when this was on, and they couldn't believe it. You know, how are we going to accomplish this? So, but somehow they did. So I'll go to the next one here. So now they're saying, okay, President Kennedy wants us to get to the moon in a little over 8 years, by the end of the decade of 1969. But we didn't even know how are we going to do that? How do we get to the moon? Well, there are three options that were thought of, especially the first two. One was called an Earth orbit rendezvous, and that's where you'd take rockets up, maybe several, into an Earth orbit. Now we were going into Earth orbit pretty soon after Shepard's flight, within a year. So we had some experience, but we had no experience rendezvousing in space, connecting parts, and then sending them off to the moon. So that was one idea. Another one was direct ascent, and that's one that a lot of the German scientists liked, like Werner von Braun. He wanted a big rocket that could, our Saturn V rocket had 5 what called F1 engines, so it each had 1.5 million pounds of thrust for combined thrust of 7.5 million. Well, the Nova, which is a bigger brother that never got developed beyond planning, would have had not 5 engines, but 8 engines. And it would have had enough power to send the whole thing to the moon without having to go into parking orbit around the Earth and then sending it out. So that was sort of discounted, although they were still thinking about it. The last one was not looked at too seriously because we just had so little experience with things like orbiting and rendezvousing and hooking up spacecraft and stuff. That was called Lunar Orbit Rendezvous. And there's this one NASA engineer at Langley named James Hubble, and he described himself as sort of a voice in the wilderness calling out to the NASA brass, you got to consider this. This is the best way we can get to the moon by the end of 1969. So I'm going to play a short clip of him talking about, now this is taken years later before Apollo 9, but he talks about how he came across this idea. So let's see if this...
Shortly after NASA came into being in 1958, the idea of using LOR, Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, as a way to going to the moon appealed to me tremendously. It appealed to me from the point of view that I could recognize all the back effects. Development, testing, fabrication, transportation problems would be eased. I knew, however, that it would meet with much opposition. People, in fact, would probably think I was crazy. I made some back-of-the-envelope types of calculations. Other type of analyses also appealed to me from the point of view that it would be cheaper, quicker, safer, and much more reliable. It was an uphill struggle all the way, but one by one, various factions of the NASA began to see and recognize the merits of the scheme. They all finally went for it. I'm, of course, very much interested in the present Apollo 9 flight, because it represents the checkout of the lander module, which will be a key piece of equipment in accomplishing the final landing mission.
So, as I said, this was recorded in 1969 before the Apollo 9 mission. The Apollo 9 mission was the first one to have a manned Earth orbital test of the lunar module. And so what he had proposed back about 1961 and 60 came to being, and that's what we went with. So in 1962, the government contract was let through several competitors, given to Grumman Corporation in Long Island, New York. The contract was to build 15 flyable lunar modules, plus test equipment and all sorts of backup things that they had to use to learn how this thing would go together. So to say that there were extreme challenges in building a vehicle that no one had built before for space only. It didn't have to have fancy edges on it or anything, because it was in a airless environment the entire time. So with the first one, off to the far left, it's more like a bug, and that's why people started calling it a bug. But they decided two stages: a descent stage, which would be the base platform when the top part of the ascent stage took off. They started with 5 legs, and then they decided, well, 5 is sort of overkill, and we got a real weight problem here. So we're going to go to 4. 4 will be just as good. They had big glass windows, and they were sitting in chairs. Well, all these chairs took weight, and some of the Grumman engineers thought, well, they don't have to be in chairs. They're weightless, or we can suspend them to the floor with cables and stuff, and so that's what they did. So they pulled all that heavy glass from the chairs, so that helped some. The second one over from the left That was the next iteration. And notice that on the first two, there's a round docking hatch, or the hatch that they would come down to the moon on. It's round. Well, in tests, they discovered that when astronauts put square backpacks on it and tried to get out, you couldn't get out a round hole with a square backpack. So they re-engineered it to about a 32-inch square. And on the third one, you see it's more a square type of hatch to get down to the surface and back. And the fourth one, on the far right, that's pretty much what like Apollo 11 looked like. And they made lots of modifications that I'll talk about. Well, things were coming along pretty well. The lunar module was always dragging behind because it was just cutting-edge technology, and trying to keep the weight down to a certain limit that the Saturn V could lift it and take it to the moon. Things are going okay up to that point until January 27th, 1967, when the Apollo 1 astronauts were killed in an on-pad test for a mission that was supposed to go up the following month. Well, that threw manned operations back 18 months as they had to redesign things. And so I guess that gave the Grumman folks more time on the lunar module. But the clock is constantly ticking down to the end of 1969. We got to do it for President Kennedy. So almost a year later, Lunar Module 1, which is in the bottom left corner, notice it doesn't have any landing gear. Well, they didn't need it for a Earth orbital flight, so the landing gear were left off. But everything else worked on it. And it's being lowered into what's called a spacecraft lunar adapter, and then there's a cone-shaped thing at the top of the rocket there. That blue cone in the bottom picture, that's a cover over the cone at the top there. And so Lunar Module 1 launched okay. It wasn't perfect, but it was the first time it got into orbit. Again, it was unmanned. And so they breathed a sigh of relief. At least the engines worked, and sometimes they had some problems with them, but they're on track now. That brought up Lunar Module 2. Remember, there were 15 lunar modules, so Lunar Module 2 was the second one. I'm going to just pass this around. If you just want to pass it around, and I'll just need this back. But these are actual coatings that are used on a real lunar module, and we use the same ones in the restoration of Lunar Module 2. Here's Lunar Module 2 getting ready to be going up into space. But we were under such a time constraint, and with the Apollo fire and all that, they decided Lunar Module 1, we know what went wrong. We think we can fix it. Let's scrap Lunar Module 2. Let's put it off to the side. Let's go with Lunar Module 3 with manned operations, which happened in March in 1969, just a few months before Apollo 11 went up. So things are really going fast here. It was possible that Lunar Module 2 could have been used for the first manned flight, but the problem was, after the fire, things had to be totally retrofitted with non-flammable materials. And Lunar Module 2 had the old stuff in it. They would have had to totally take it apart, and that would have been prohibitive in time and effort to do. So that's another reason why they pushed it off. But some people, when I've been at the museum in the National Air and Space Museum, they talk to us while we're working on the restoration. And they say, well, that's just a replica. No, this was a real thing, and I'll show you some pictures of it. This could have gone into space. So they used Lunar Module 2 for testing to see how much can a landing gear take with a bad landing or a tilted landing before it's going to break. And I thought it was sort of funny. The hardest landing recorded was Apollo 15, which was an all Air Force crew. And it's funny, all the other lunar modules missions were Navy crews, which you'd think they'd have the hard landing, being aircraft carrier pilots, but it was the Air Force crew that landed the hardest. It still didn't damage it, but it did knock it back a little bit into a crater. And so when NASA finished all their basic test to destruction with Lunar Module 2 in a 1/6 environment in a vacuum chamber, it went on to they call them World's Fairs, and the one in 1970 was in Osaka, Japan. So here it is in Osaka. It was there for about a year or so. And so after that, it came back home, back to the Smithsonian. And by the way, everything that NASA decides not using anymore, they automatically go to the Smithsonian, because the Smithsonian is an arm of the government, and that's just the way it works. So Lunar Module 2 became the property of the Smithsonian. Back in the early 70s, there was no National Air and Space Museum. It was the Arts and Industries building, still on the National Mall there. And you can see it next to the Wright Flyer, and then the lower picture of it on display. So it was there for several years. On July 4th, 1976, the National Air and Space Museum opened on the National Mall. How many people have been there? Just a show of hands. Oh, good. So many of you have. And President Gerald Ford was the president at the time, and he's being shown an artifact by Michael Collins of Apollo 11, who was the first director of the National Air and Space Museum. And behind them is a gentleman named Kurt Diebus, a German engineer who was with von Braun, and he was in charge of the Kennedy Space Center operations. So Lunar Module 2 was installed at that time in 1976, and it sat in that same spot. If you've been to that museum, it was near the McDonald's off a wing there. It was there for 40 years. And they dressed it up basically to look like Apollo 11, but there was a lot of controversy and care taken because Lunar Module 2 had its own history. We didn't want to just blanket cover and say this is Apollo 11 Eagle, although it looks much like it. But Lunar Module 2 had a huge, important part in the development of getting us to the moon. So anyway, that's where it was all those years. So 40 years later, we are starting to do a what I call a mini restoration in 2009. That was for the 40th anniversary of the first moon landing. And you can see in the bottom picture some of this, it's called Kapton material, sort of an aluminized mylar. Some of it's very thin, and it was just starting to break up. I think the sun windows and stuff were beating down on it over years, and it was really looking pretty ratty. So they decided to do a restoration, and here we are. And we did everything in situ, or basically on site, and people could walk by and ask us questions about it when we had time to answer them. But people got to see us pulling this thing apart all the time. You may ask, well, how did I get to be on this restoration team? Well, I had been doing models for a long time, and I did several. If you look, I'll go clockwise from the large Saturn V. That's a large flyable model, although this one didn't fly. But this one was on display for 25 years at the National Air and Space Museum. It was just taken down in January as they're doing a total reboot of the entire museum, which is going to take place over the next 8 years or so. The one in the top right, the orange and white, that was called a Navajo. It was an acronym of North American and VAHO, but it was like a primeval cruise missile, and they had all they had the Smithsonian had was a rocket engine, so this was to show them what the thing looked like and the size of it and that. The one on the right of you see a Saturn V in the middle photo, and the green and white one, that's the Soviet secret moon rocket called an N1, and shows the scale of it. Our Saturn V was 33 feet in diameter. The N1 was 55 feet in diameter. And I mentioned those 5 huge Saturn F1 engines on the Saturn V first stage. This had 30 engines ringed around and 6 in the center. It launched 4 times and blew up 4 times, and fortunately never went with crew on board. So, but eventually that was canceled, especially after we landed on the moon with Apollo 11. The one on the bottom right there, that's Worldview 3, a quarter scale model built by a company here in a Digital Globe in Colorado, and it was assembled by Ball Aerospace in Boulder. And then the one on the far left there, it's a full-scale model of what was a super secret spy satellite that we launched to take pictures over Russia, and it's actually still in orbit. This was launched in '63, and it's going to be up there for another couple hundred years, so it's still up there, but it's dead as a doornail anyway. So our project manager for this restoration I talked about on Lunar Module 2 was Paul Fiel, and he's just a brilliant guy, and I've never met anybody living who knows more about the Lunar Module, the command module, and all these things. He's just incredible. So he was our project manager, and he actually did a restoration. There he is in this bottom picture. Remember I said there were 15 lunar modules? Well, Lunar Module 12 was Apollo 17, and the last 3 were canceled. The last 3 missions were canceled. So this is actually Lunar Module 13 that became property of the Smithsonian, and this went to the Cradle of Aviation Museum on Long Island in New York, very close to where the real ones were built. So he redid that with a team, and he got to learn from what they called grummies, the guys that had actually worked on it. Now they're long retired, but they said, okay, this is the way we did it, you know, and they used the Kapton tape, and as you see the different foil parts, Kapton parts, John Young, who was on Apollo 10 and the commander of Apollo 16, when he saw the first lunar module come up, he said, "This looks like some Cub Scout project here," because the tape is every which way, and there are rips in it, so they fix it, you know, and then it didn't make any difference again what it looked like as long as it did its thing. So we had Paul there, who was just a tremendous lead for us. So it was that first restoration. It wasn't quite as much as the second one that I'll talk about. It's very challenging work. It's extremely dusty inside there. We pulled these things called catenaries. You know, this Kapton is full of dust and just miserable. But we had a couple interesting surprises. One of them is Dr. Alan Nadell, who's the curator of the Smithsonian, and I am holding this container there. Even NASA didn't know about it, but it had been in there for 40 plus years. And it had been in where you see the United States, just off to the left a little bit. It had been in a bracket, and basically what it is, it's a high gain antenna, mostly for television use. Apollo 11 actually carried that, and they were prepared to erect it, as showing on this photo of Apollo 12 here. It's big, it's like 10 feet in diameter, and it all pops up and gives you a better television signal. With Apollo 11, they said, that looks good enough. And they had such a short time on the moon that they didn't want to waste any extra time. So Apollo 12 did set it up. The only bad part was that one of the astronauts accidentally took the camera when he was moving it, looking right at the sun and burned out the lens. And so for the entire, I think they did 2 moonwalks, and we didn't have any pictures, live pictures of it. So anyway, that's the way it goes. Here, another volunteer and I are working on precisely cutting strips of Kapton that's going to put, you can see some of the gray areas that have been uncovered, and we totally recovered the entire descent stage with new stuff. And it was sort of cool, when the Apollo 11 astronauts had been to the Smithsonian for previous things like the 30th and 35th anniversary, they took their pictures in front of the command module, the Columbia, not the Lunar Module, because it was looking sort of ratty, like I mentioned. Well, this is just with a new facelift, and they posed for the official picture in front of this that we had just completed about a week previous. So that made us feel pretty good. So the National Air and Space Museum got a big $30 million grant from Boeing, the Boeing Corporation, Boeing Company, to redo the center part of the National Air and Space Museum. And that's where all the heavy hitters are, like a Columbia spacecraft, the Spirit of St. Louis, the Bell X-1, things like that. So this is a little promo. I think it takes about 2 minutes of what they were planning on doing.
Since 1976, the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum has displayed the most renowned collection of historic air and spacecraft in the world. More than 60,000 artifacts that bring the rich history of flight to life.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Now, thanks to a $30 million donation from Boeing, the museum's main attraction, Milestones of Flight Hall, will undergo a 21st century transformation. Iconic symbols of amazing discoveries that span the aerial age to the space age and beyond will show how these events connect to one another and reveal untold stories of the people who helped make history. John Glenn's Friendship 7 spacecraft, Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis, revolutionary turbojet engines, and Telstar, the first communications satellite in space. Completed in time for the museum's 40th anniversary in 2016, visitors will experience a dynamic interactive display, melded with an integrated mobile experience. More than 7 million people visit the Air and Space Museum every year. Soon, they'll be marveling at an exhibit like no other. This is where history is preserved, for the pioneers of the past who advanced our world, and the explorers of the future who will transform it for generations to come.
So 6 years after we'd completed that first, what I call mini restoration, we had a full-blown one. That lunar module had been in place for 40 years. Now for the first time in 40 years, they're going to pull it apart and move everything down the hall to the center of the museum there. And this is a little time-lapse photography of how they did that. So easy. So they moved it to the center part of the museum, but we weren't alone there. Just previous to that, they had taken, for the first time in 40 years, taken the Spirit of St. Louis down and did some restoration on that. I got to peek my head inside the cockpit. And if you've seen the Jimmy Stewart movie, he's marking with a pencil. He had 5 fuel tanks and he had to make sure he balanced the fuel. You look inside there, the marks are there. Charles Lindbergh did do that, so I thought that was pretty cool. It had gone back up by the time they moved the ascent and descent stages back. But it was also down there was the Chuck Yeager's X-1. And it was like right next to us. And it had these, the bottom right picture, it had these elaborate angle of attack indicators, all these things that could easily be broken because we were basically having to squirm our way around, making sure we didn't touch any of this stuff. But this hatch was, I thought, really cool, being able to, I didn't touch it, but those of you who might have seen The Right Stuff, just before Yeager was going to be doing his flight that was going to try to break the sound barrier, the night before he was riding horses in the high desert there with his wife, and either got thrown off or fell off, and he either broke or damaged some ribs on his right side there. And he didn't want to tell anybody because he'd be replaced. They had other pilots that, yeah, we'll do it. So, but he could not, you have to use your right hand to close that hatch there. It's this type of thing. He could not do that. So there was another engineer there who was a good friend of his, and he sort of took him aside and said, I got a problem, you know, you got to help me, somehow help me to lever this latch down when I get inside. So the guy, just in a hangar like this, he sees a broom, and he cuts off about this piece of there, and he says, put that in your jacket, and you can use your left hand to lever that thing down. And so that's what he did. And we never saw a broom handle, but I just, things like this for aviation and space geeks like me, this is just really, really cool stuff. It's like right in front of your face. So here's Paul Fiel, and we started right away with removing ascent stage panels. And we photographed each one, we had a map, and tagged them, and then moved them to other places. A few of them were repainted, but most of them we kept just as is because, again, Lunar Module 2 had its own important history. On the back of one of the panels was a listing by a lot of the Grumman engineers that signed this in 1969 before it went over to Osaka, Japan. And we found that for the first time there. I imagine most of those people aren't with us still, but it was neat seeing little surprises like that. So we're working on the ascent stage, cleaning it up, removing panels, things like that. While we're doing that, we're also working on the descent stage, and we stripped that thing totally down to the bare metal, and that was also a big project, having to use scaffolds and things like that. One of the items that was particularly interesting to us, and actually the whole National Air and Space Museum, was this thing called a Mesa, a modularized equipment stowage assembly. And if you're coming down the ladder, it's on your left, and that's where the camera was, that when you saw that ghostly image of Armstrong coming down the ladder, that was the camera inside that, where that green lanyard is there. Nobody had seen this thing for over 40 years. We didn't know what was inside it. Sort of like opening you know, an old safe or something like that. So we got permission to pull it down for the first time in, like I said, over 40 years, and then open the thing up, and all the NASA brass, or I mean the NASA, National Air and Space Museum brass the NASM people were there. And so these pictures are taken just seconds after we started pulling this thing off. So here's, Paul is now describing about 2 minutes after we started opening this up what we're finding.
This is the big toolbox that the astronauts would pull a little pin and it deployed, came flopping out, and the most important piece for us was the TV camera that would fit here. You had a little bubble in the thermal blanket and it would poke a little hole and you would get the images. Once the crew was down on the surface, they would just rip these blankets off, and what you would have here is all a bunch of tools that they would use for collecting samples and things. There were two big boxes. These are the lunar sample return containers that would fit inside here. This table would open up. There's a Velcro snap. It would open up, and the astronaut would work on the top, the table. He'd have the sample box right there, and he'd be putting all his samples together and then closing it up and taking it up into the surface. Other kinds of equipment here, we've got lens holders. We have, this is SRC, sample return container. There's a solar wind composition. So this is one of the first Apollo missions. On Apollo 11, they had a solar wind. Wow. There's a TV tripod. So once he's finished with taking pictures through here, at some point he removes the camera, sticks it on a tripod. There's a bunch of wire that comes out of one of these holes that lets him go maybe 25 feet, 30 feet away from the surface, so we get a nice view of the crew working. These things, it's a portable life support system. They're backpacked. They had batteries. In the old LEM, they had batteries mounted on the other corner. When they got this Mesa, Modularized Equipment Stowage Assembly, it was originally called the Modularized Equipment Stowage System, but the idea of deploying your mess on the moon sounded a little odd to them, so they changed it. So the Plith batteries, so what they'll do is they'll take some of these things up between space lunar walks, go up, and then put a new battery in their backpacks, and they're all fresh for the next EVA after they recharge it with water and oxygen. What else is this? This is, well, it's a lens holder. I don't know what DN means. Here's a scoop, of course. Hammer and a scoop, classic thing. So the scoop, if you ever look at the hammer when they're banging on it, there's a little edge that sort of that catches on their wrist, and then there's a little extra thing that extends down. Well, that's to fit right in here. So some of the way the hammer looks is just for storage in this box. And of course the scoop does what scoops do. Scoops. Dirt usually, hopefully, lunar dirt. Regolith is the correct term for the dirt. So that's it. I don't know what.
So that was very exciting for all of us, including the senior brass at the NASM there. So once we got the ascent stage all cleaned up, we craned it over and remounted it back on the descent stage. But there's still tons of work to do. Now I was more than happy to help out with this, but I was tasked with making a few replica parts that weren't on Lunar Module 2 because it was an Earth orbital mission. This is supposed to look like Lunar Module 5 or Eagle. So one of the things I did, and just some crude drawings up on my end, there was a called an EVA antenna, and that allowed them to talk between Houston and the spacecraft and the backpacks while they're on the moon. So here it is completed, and we're just about ready to mount it. And Paul, in the center picture, Paul and one of the museum technicians up on this big stairs type of thing, hydraulic lift, and mounting it into place there. And that part on the right there, that's all scratch built, of course, to look like the real one. What they did with this antenna, which is about 50 inches tall, it had to be cranked down for most of the flight except for on the moon. Because if it's sticking up when they're docking, it's going to stick the command module. So that's why they had that. Other people worked on various parts. These were just extremely gifted and talented people. Here I am working on attaching some panels on the aft end of the ascent stage there. We were able to find what's called a drogue, and that's the part that the probe on the command module hooked up to bring them together in space. We actually found one that was in storage, and then we put that in. So that had never been there before with this Lunar Module 2. So it added a lot of realism, because it would have been like that on the real thing. A couple other parts that I built, covers and a storage bracket for that EVA antenna that you can see with the spikes there in the bottom picture. One other thing I did was a replica of the flag carrier. Now, on the first couple missions, it was mounted on the vertical rail inside a stainless steel tube, and then covered with Kapton and other Mylar and stuff like that. The reason for all that protection was the descent stage engine. As it gets close, it's going to really start heating up anything close there, and if they just had the flag there, it would have probably burned up. So this NASA engineer in Houston here, just a few weeks before Apollo 11, he's testing how you pull this thing apart, how the astronauts do, to erect the flag. So this is Apollo 11's in a sort of exploded view, how it fit into the carrier, and they were able to put it together. They had almost no training at all because everything else was so important. They just figure it out, and you have 3 minutes to do it. So that's what they did, but it worked out. So I built the replica from plans, and even though you'll never see it, I put a 3 by 5 foot nylon American flag folded in there like the real one that's inside there. The flag carrier was installed in June of 16 when we just about finished with the project, which took over a year. So the last thing we had to do is someone had to go up there and do the final closeout of the Ascent stage, and that'd be the last person to go in there. Unfortunately, that overhead hatch, which is on a hinge, it apparently was locked before, and as they were moving the thing around, it came loose, and they heard this kabong, and it went up there, and fortunately there's no damage. But one of the things I was supposed to do, we figured out, once I latched it back up, I was going to take some cloth tape and make sure if that ever happened again, it wouldn't fall down and possibly do some damage. So I'm going to show just a little bit of a video I took of me inside it. I just put a cell phone, so it's not great quality, but I'm working on it here some. So that's the overhead hatch there that I'm monkeying with and trying to get the latch to go properly, make sure I have a good seal. Good. That's locked. That's definitely locked. Okay. I didn't want to be the guy who was the guy who did for the second time, screwing up the hatch and having it fall down again. So I want to be absolutely certain that it stays that way. So we had this heavy-duty cloth tapes, and I secured that. And so that we're running a little bit low on time. So anyway, I secured it in such a point that if it ever came loose again, it's not going to fall down and possibly do damage to it. So in a what I call an homage of what the real Grummies did, when they finished the Lunar Module, they took a team picture basically, and this is some of the team here. Paul on the left, I'm on the extreme right. Dr. Nadell in the dark blue shirt, but just a tremendous group of people that worked on this thing for about a year and a half. and it really came out beautifully. So here it is, where it is today. Now, I should say that there's another program going on now that's we're right in the middle of. The entire museum is going to be renovated. It will look almost nothing like what you see it or have seen it before. This will get moved around, and I'm not sure how much, but big parts of the museum will be closed for periods of time. And the date that they're shooting for is July 1st, 2026. And that will be the 50th anniversary of the opening of the National Air and Space Museum on the Mall. So anyway, that's what they're shooting for, and I'll be doing some of the work there too if I'm able. And so there it is today. So are there any questions that I can answer if possible?